Bomb bay doors open. Bombs away!
Out of every 5 B-29 crewmen captured by Japanese forces, only 3 survived to see liberation. For those who did make it, their average time in captivity was measured not in months, but in days of torture that would break most human beings. They faced execution rates higher than any other group of Allied prisoners, and their treatment violated every international law ever written about warfare. But what happened to them goes beyond what most people can imagine. And now, you're going to understand why their fate was sealed the moment they parachuted onto Japanese soil. When people think about the air war over Japan, they usually picture formations of silver bombers dropping their payloads and returning safely to base. But the reality for hundreds of B-29 crews was drastically different. The Boeing B-29 Superfortress was the most advanced bomber of World War II, capable of flying over 3,000 miles with 10 tons of bombs. Stationed in the Mariana Islands from late 1944 onward, these massive aircraft carried 11-man crews on missions that lasted up to 16 hours. The Americans needed these bombers because Japan's industrial cities were the only way to cripple the enemy's war machine without a costly invasion of the home islands. Flying from bases on Saipan, Tinian, and Guam, the B-29s could reach any target in Japan. But this also meant that any crew going down would be landing in enemy territory with zero chance of friendly rescue. The Japanese knew exactly what the B-29s represented. Every bomb that fell on their cities came from these aircraft, and the civilian population saw the devastation firsthand. By early 1945, American firebombing campaigns were systematically destroying Japanese urban centers. The raid on Tokyo during the night of March 9th to 10th, 1945, killed more people in a single night than either atomic bomb would later that year. Over 15 square miles of the city burned, and approximately 100,000 civilians died in the firestorm. The Japanese government understood these raids were breaking the nation's ability to continue the war, but they also saw them as acts of terror against defenseless populations. This perception would prove catastrophic for any B-29 crew member who fell into Japanese hands. On August 13, 1942, the Japanese government passed what became known as the Enemy Airmen's Act. This law declared that any Allied airmen participating in bombing raids against Japanese-held territory would be treated as violators of international law rather than legitimate prisoners of war. The language was specific and deliberate. It stated that captured airmen were not protected by the Geneva Convention and could be tried as war criminals for what the Japanese called indiscriminate bombing of civilians. What this meant in practice was that B-29 crews were marked for execution from the moment this law took effect. American intelligence knew about the law, but underestimated just how extensively it would be applied. They believed it might result in show trials and a few executions for propaganda purposes. The reality was far worse. Between 1944 and 1945, approximately 570 American airmen were captured after their aircraft were shot down over Japan or Japanese-controlled territory. The vast majority were B-29 crew members. Of these men, less than 60% survived to see liberation in August 1945. This mortality rate of over 40% was significantly higher than the overall Allied prisoner of war death rate in Japanese captivity, which itself was a horrifying 27%. But the raw numbers don't tell the full story of what these men endured. To understand their fate, you need to know what happened from the moment they hit the ground. When a B-29 went down, crew members who successfully bailed out faced immediate danger even before landing. There are documented cases of Japanese civilians and soldiers shooting at parachuting airmen while they were still in the air. One crewman from the 462nd Bombardment Group was machine-gunned to death while descending, his parachute offering no protection from the gunfire below. Those who made it to the ground alive often faced mobs of enraged civilians. The people in these areas had just experienced bombing raids that killed their families and destroyed their homes. They saw the distinctive American flight suits and attacked with whatever weapons they had available. Rocks, clubs, farming tools, and improvised weapons were used to beat captured airmen. Multiple survivors reported being stoned and struck with iron bars immediately after capture. In some cases, civilians killed crew members on the spot before military or police forces could intervene. The crew of a B-29 that crashed near Tokyo on March 10, 1945, had 3 survivors who were beaten to death by civilians within minutes of capture. For those who survived the initial capture, the next stop was usually the Kempeitai headquarters. The Kempeitai were Japan's military police, and they operated with almost unlimited authority over prisoners. They ran the interrogation centers, and their methods were systematically brutal. The Kempeitai had been trained in torture techniques that were designed to extract information while inflicting maximum psychological damage. Captured airmen described interrogations that lasted for hours with no breaks. Questions were repeated endlessly, and any answer deemed unsatisfactory resulted in immediate physical punishment. The most common torture was beating with bamboo sticks, called kendo sticks. These were used to strike prisoners on the head, back, and joints. The beatings left massive bruises and frequently broke bones, but they were calculated to avoid killing the prisoner too quickly. Sleep deprivation was standard practice. Prisoners were kept in small cells and prevented from sleeping for days at a time. Guards would wake them every few minutes if they tried to rest. Water torture was extensively documented by survivors. The technique involved forcing large amounts of water down the prisoner's throat until their stomach distended grotesquely. Then guards would jump on the prisoner's abdomen to force the water back out. This process was repeated multiple times during interrogation sessions. Electric shock torture was administered. Using various methods, some involved telephone generators that delivered sustained electrical current to the prisoner's body. Others used the main power grid to electrify metal chairs or tables that prisoners were strapped to. For female prisoners, electrodes were inserted into body cavities. The pain was described as unbearable, and the psychological terror of knowing it could be repeated at any moment broke many prisoners mentally before they broke physically. But perhaps the most horrifying aspect of Kempeitai interrogation was its ultimate futility. The Japanese interrogators wanted specific military information about bombing targets, aircraft capabilities, and future raid plans. However, most B-29 crew members were junior officers or enlisted men who had no access to strategic planning information. They could provide only basic details about their own aircraft and crew, information that had no intelligence value. Yet the torture continued regardless. Prisoners who insisted they knew nothing were accused of lying and tortured more severely. Those who fabricated information to stop the pain were beaten for providing false intelligence. There was no way to satisfy the interrogators because the information they demanded simply didn't exist at the crew member level. The Kempeitai operated a special headquarters facility in Tokyo that became notorious among the small number of survivors. Prisoners were kept in cells that had previously been horse stalls, approximately 6 feet by 6 feet in dimension. Multiple prisoners were often crammed into these tiny spaces. They received almost no food, typically just a small amount of rice once per day. Medical care was completely denied as a matter of official policy. Wounded prisoners were left to suffer without treatment, and their injuries became targets for additional beatings. If a prisoner cried out in pain, guards would beat not just that prisoner, but everyone else in the cell as collective punishment. The psychological impact of hearing fellow prisoners screaming during torture sessions was profound. Occurred daily was devastating. Several survivors reported that the sounds of torture were worse than experiencing it directly because the anticipation and inability to help created unbearable mental anguish. Then there were the public displays. Japanese authorities occasionally took prisoners to downtown areas for public exhibition and abuse. One B-29 bombardier was tied to posts in a schoolyard where Japanese soldiers practiced bayonet charges on him. The final thrust went through his neck and into his throat. Another crew member was placed on exhibition in downtown Tokyo for 5 hours, where civilians were allowed to kick him, stone him, and beat him. He was kicked unconscious multiple times and revived only to experience more abuse. These public tortures served dual purposes. They satisfied the civilian population's desire for revenge, while also serving as propaganda to show that American airmen were being punished for their crimes against Japanese civilians. Formal trials were conducted under the Enemy Airmen's Act, but they were complete farces. The proceedings typically lasted less than an hour. Prisoners were brought before military courts where they faced charges of indiscriminate bombing and murder of civilians. They had no defense counsel, no ability to present evidence, and no right to appeal. The verdict was predetermined. 11 were beheaded at a rifle range. Their execution occurred just weeks before Japan's surrender, when it was clear to Japanese leadership that the war was lost. Yet the killings continued. 15 American airmen were beheaded at Fukuoka on August 15, 1945, hours after the Japanese government had announced its intention to surrender. The methods of execution varied, but beheading was most common. Sword beheadings required skill, and botched executions were not uncommon. In one documented case, 2 B-29 crew members, sentenced to death at Osaka military prison, endured a failed beheading attempt that had to be covered up. The executioner's strike failed to sever the head completely, and the prisoners had to be finished with gunshots to the head at point-blank range. Some prisoners were taken to remote locations and shot by firing squads. Others were killed by lethal injection, with prison doctors administering fatal doses while pretending to provide medical care. Between March and June of 1945 alone, 9 seriously wounded airmen held at Tokyo Kempeitai headquarters were executed by injection specifically because they required medical resources the Japanese were unwilling to provide. At least 132 Allied airmen are confirmed to have been executed after summary trials during 1944 and 1945. But this number only includes documented cases where records survived the war. The actual total is certainly higher, because Japanese military and police units systematically destroyed evidence as Allied forces approached. Burial records were erased, bodies were exhumed and cremated, and documentation was burned. Many crew members simply vanished, with no record of their capture or fate. Their families received only the official designation of missing in action, never learning what actually happened. Beyond formal executions, many prisoners died from neglect and abuse. The death rate from disease and starvation in Japanese prisoner of war camps was astronomical. Captured airmen received minimal food, typically a small bowl of rice that provided perhaps 600 calories per day. Men who weighed over 200 pounds when captured shrank to under 120 pounds within months. Diseases including dysentery, beriberi, and diphtheria spread rapidly in the unsanitary conditions. Prisoners with dysentery were denied food entirely and left to starve to death. One B-29 crew member caught diphtheria and became paralyzed during his captivity, surviving only because the war ended before he died from complications. There were also cases of what can only be described as medical atrocities. At Kyushu University in Fukuoka, 9 B-29 crew members who survived their aircraft crash on May 5, 1945, were taken to the medical school's anatomy department. Over the following 3 weeks, they were subjected to vivisection experiments. These were not legitimate medical procedures. They were torture sessions conducted under the guise of surgical research. The prisoners were not anesthetized. They were conscious while parts of their bodies were removed for examination. All 9 died as a direct result of these experiments. The doctors and officers involved were later tried and convicted of war crimes, but the suffering these men endured cannot be overstated. During the final months of the war, there were scattered reports of cannibalism involving captured Allied airmen. Japanese soldiers, often starving themselves due to disrupted supply lines, killed prisoners and consumed their flesh. One Indian prisoner of war testified at war crimes trials that, on November 12, 1944, he witnessed Kempeitai officers behead an Allied pilot and then cut flesh from the body's arms, legs, and buttocks. The flesh was carried away and fried. Another witness described a systematic process in New Guinea where Japanese soldiers selected one prisoner each day, killed them, and consumed the meat. While the exact number of B-29 crew members who suffered this fate is unknown, testimony indicates it occurred multiple times in different locations. The psychological trauma for those who survived was immense and permanent. Many prisoners spent the rest of their lives unable to speak about their experiences. One bombardier who was displayed naked in a cage at Tokyo Zoo for public abuse weighed 215 pounds when captured. At liberation, he weighed 122 pounds. The physical scars were visible, but the mental damage ran far deeper. Survivors reported nightmares, flashbacks, and an inability to process what had been done to them. Some never recovered psychologically. The Japanese policy of treating B-29 crews as war criminals rather than prisoners of war created a system where torture and execution were not aberrations, but standard procedure. Every captured crew member faced the same fate, with only the timing and specific method varying. When Japan surrendered in August 1945, Allied occupation forces conducted extensive investigations into the treatment of prisoners. The evidence they uncovered was overwhelming and horrifying. War crimes trials were held in Yokohama, where surviving prisoners provided detailed testimony about their captivity. Japanese officers and guards were convicted and sentenced for their roles in torture, illegal executions, and medical experiments. But for the families of those who didn't survive, justice could never undo what had happened. The men who died in captivity suffered fates that violated every principle of civilized warfare and human decency. Out of approximately 570 B-29 crew members captured, nearly 250 died before liberation. That's a mortality rate that exceeds even the horrific statistics from other prisoner-of-war populations in Japanese custody. These men were not just casualties of war. They were victims of a systematic policy that declared them criminals and subjected them to treatment that shocked even hardened war crimes investigators. The Enemy Airmen's Act created the legal framework, but the implementation went far beyond anything the law specifically authorized. Individual guards, interrogators, and officers took it upon themselves to inflict suffering that served no military purpose and violated every international agreement about the treatment of prisoners. The story of what happened to captured B-29 crews stands as one of the darkest chapters of the Pacific War. These men volunteered to fly some of the most dangerous missions of the entire conflict. They knew the risks of mechanical failure, enemy fighters, and anti-aircraft fire. But they could not have imagined the fate that awaited them if they were forced to bail out over Japan. The systematic torture, the mock trials, the executions, and the medical atrocities represent a level of cruelty that defies comprehension. For the families who lost loved ones in Japanese captivity, the pain was compounded by not knowing exactly what happened. Many crew members were simply listed as missing, their final days unknown. It wasn't until the war crimes trials revealed the full scope of abuse that families learned the truth. The survivors, who made it home, carried those experiences for the rest of their lives. They returned to a country that wanted to celebrate victory and move forward, but they remained trapped in the memories of what they had endured. Some spoke publicly about their experiences, providing testimony that helped convict war criminals. Others retreated into silence, unable or unwilling to relive the trauma. All of them bore physical and psychological scars that never fully healed. The weight of having survived when so many didn't created survivor's guilt that many struggled with for decades. Today, the story of captured B-29 crews is not widely known outside of military history circles. The broader narrative of World War II focuses on major battles and strategic decisions, leaving little room for the individual stories of prisoners who suffered and died far from the fighting. But their story deserves to be remembered and understood. These men represented the human cost of strategic bombing campaigns and the complete breakdown of international law that occurred in the Pacific Theater. They were ordinary Americans who found themselves in extraordinary circumstances, facing an enemy that showed no mercy and a system designed to inflict maximum suffering before death. If you want to hear more stories like this, help us out by subscribing.